There are symbols, and then there are people. The difficulty with John Wayne is that the symbol became so enormous, so thoroughly embedded in the American imagination, that the person underneath it became almost impossible to see. He was the West. He was the frontier. He was the straight-shooting, slow-walking, quietly dangerous embodiment of a particular idea of American manhood that the 20th century needed and that he provided across 179 films with a consistency that had no precedent and has had no successor. But he was also a man who played chess, who loved boats with the genuine passion of someone who finds on water a quality of freedom that land cannot provide, who read voraciously, who was funnier in private than the granite public image suggested, who was afraid, at the end, not of dying, but of leaving things unsaid, and who said them anyway, because he was not, whatever else he was, a man who left things undone. Marion Robert Morrison was born on May 26, 1907, in Winterset, Iowa, the son of a pharmacist who moved the family to California when Marion was 6. The name Marion embarrassed him for his entire childhood. He was a large physical boy in an era when large physical boys were expected to have large physical names, and the nickname Duke, given to him by local firemen who admired the Airedale Terrier he walked to school every day, was an improvement he adopted immediately and kept for the rest of his life. Duke Morrison. Then, when the studio system got hold of him, John Wayne, a name chosen by a director in about 30 seconds with no particular thought, for a man who would carry it into legend. He arrived in Hollywood through a football scholarship to the University of Southern California, a summer job as a prop man on movie sets to pay for expenses, and a friendship with director John Ford that would define both their careers. Ford saw in the young prop man something that the screen tests confirmed, a physical presence of unusual authority, a way of moving through space that was entirely his own, a quality of absolute conviction that translated directly to the camera without requiring the mediation of technique. He was not, in the conventional sense, a trained actor. He was something that training could not produce, a natural in the specific meaning of that word, someone in whom the camera found something true and transmitted it without distortion. His early career was the long apprenticeship of the B-Western, years of low-budget pictures that nobody remembers and that served their purpose, which was to build, film by film, the physical vocabulary that would eventually become iconic. The walk, the drawl, the particular way he held his body in confrontation, not aggressive, but absolutely immovable, like a landscape feature that has decided not to be moved. He was developing a character, though he would not have used that word, because the character he was developing was himself, or the best, most distilled version of himself, clarified by repetition into something that an audience could read in a single frame. John Ford gave him his first great role in Stagecoach in 1939, and the film announced to anyone paying attention that the B-Western apprentice had become something else entirely. The Ringo Kid, outlaw, gentleman, man of honor in a world that had forfeited its claim to honor, was the template from which the John Wayne persona was drawn for the next 40 years. Not complicated in the literary sense, complicated in the human sense, a man whose moral clarity existed not because the world was simple, but because he had decided, in the face of a world that was not simple, to be simple himself, to stand for something, to shoot straight, literally and otherwise. He made westerns because the western was the form that fit him, but he was not limited by it. He made war films, detective films, comedies, and in all of them the essential quality persisted, the quality that Ford had first identified and that the audience had recognized, and that no amount of genre variation could obscure. He was a man you could trust, on screen, which meant, in the particular alchemy of cinema, that millions of people felt they could trust him in general, felt that he was something solid in a world that was not always solid. The politics are part of the story and must be addressed honestly. John Wayne was a conservative in an era when Hollywood's dominant culture was moving left, and he held his positions with the same stubbornness he brought to everything else. He supported the House Un-American Activities Committee during the McCarthy era, a position that put him in direct opposition to many of his colleagues and that history has not judged kindly. He made statements about race and about the displacement of Native Americans that were, by any reasonable measure, indefensible, and he made them in interviews with a bluntness that left no room for charitable interpretation. These things are true. They are part of John Wayne, not separate from him, and the man who said them was the same man who made the films and walked the walk and carried the symbol. He was not a simple figure, whatever the simplicity of the roles suggested. But there is also this. In an industry that ran, during the blacklist years, on the fuel of accusation and compliance, John Wayne did something that did not fit the caricature of the reactionary bully. When John Ford, his mentor, his friend, the man who had made his career, was hauled before the Directors Guild to be condemned for a film that powerful people found politically inconvenient, it was John Wayne who stood up in that room and defended him, not from political alignment, from loyalty. The distinction mattered to him, and it should matter to us. He married 3 times, all 3 wives Mexican, a biographical detail that complicates the public image in ways that his political detractors preferred not to acknowledge. He had 7 children, whom he spoke of with a warmth that was entirely genuine and entirely at odds with the stoic exterior. He was, by the accounts of everyone who knew him well, a more affectionate and more emotionally available father than the public persona suggested. The films of his middle and late career are where the persona began to acquire the depth that made it something more than a type. Red River in 1948, directed by Howard Hawks, showed for the first time a John Wayne capable of genuine complexity, a man whose strength had curdled into tyranny, whose certainty had become cruelty, and who was brought back from the edge not by force, but by love. It was his own favorite of his performances, and you can see why. The Searchers in 1956 went further, gave him a character whose racism was not incidental, but central, whose obsession was both heroic and monstrous, whose final gesture of grace was the more powerful for everything that preceded it. It is, by the consensus of critics and filmmakers worldwide, one of the greatest films ever made, directed by Ford, carried by Wayne. He won his only Academy Award for True Grit in 1969, playing Rooster Cogburn, a one-eyed, overweight, magnificently disreputable U.S. Marshal, and doing so with a humor and a self-awareness that the earlier films had not always permitted. He was 62 years old, and the Oscar was partly a recognition of the role, and partly a recognition of a career that the Academy had been slow to honor, and was now belatedly acknowledging as something that deserved acknowledgement. The cancer came first in 1964, lung cancer, the result of decades of heavy smoking, removed surgically in an operation that his doctors considered a near miracle. He spoke about it publicly, urging people to get screened, calling himself Big C in interviews with the gallows humor of a man who had decided that fear was not going to be the last thing people saw from him. He recovered, he worked, he made more films. He thought he had beaten it. The cancer returned in 1979, this time in his stomach, and this time there was no surgical miracle available. He died on June 11, 1979, at UCLA Medical Center at the age of 72, surrounded by his children and by the faith that had sustained him in his final years. He converted to Roman Catholicism on his deathbed, a private decision that his family honored and that he had been moving toward, those who knew him said, for longer than the public understood. The country mourned him in the way it mourns the loss of something it had taken for granted, with the particular grief of realizing too late that the thing had been irreplaceable. President Carter issued a statement. Congress passed a resolution. The flags did not go to half-staff, but something in the national imagination did. What he left behind is not simply a body of work, though the body of work is extraordinary in its scale and uneven in its quality, and contains in its best moments performances of genuine power. What he left behind is an image, the most durable image of American masculinity that the 20th century produced. The man who stands at the edge of the frame, silhouetted against the sky, ready to ride in or ride out, whose commitment to justice is not complicated by ambivalence, and whose courage is not performed but simply present, the way it is present in certain landscapes, in certain kinds of weather. That image is not the whole truth about John Wayne. The whole truth is more complicated, more interesting, and more human than the image allows. But the image captured something real, something about the possibility of conviction, of loyalty, of a willingness to stand for something in a world that makes standing for things expensive. And the people who responded to it across 6 decades of cinema were responding not to a fiction, but to a need, the need for evidence that such things exist. He was not the West. He was a man from Iowa who played the West for 50 years with enough conviction that the distinction stopped mattering. Marion Robert Morrison became John Wayne, became the Duke, became a symbol, and then, at the very end, in a hospital room in Los Angeles, became Marion Robert Morrison again, a man saying the things he had not yet said, making his peace, leaving the symbol behind. The walk and the voice, as the man who wrote about him said, could never be faked. They were his. All the way to the end, they were his.